Hey guys, tonight we ease into a story that begins in a place where the sun seems never to rest. Imagine yourself in ancient Persia, standing beneath a sky so clear and mercilessly bright that even your eyelids feel sunburned. You squint across a wide, sandy horizon, the air trembling in waves of heat. You can hear your own breath, heavy and sticky, as if the atmosphere itself weighs a little too much. The ground feels like a stove, and even the shade of a palm tree seems to mock you with its thin relief. This is a land of extremes. Towering mountains dusted with snow, yes, but also deserts where water evaporates before it can settle. And right in this contradiction lies the story of human stubbornness, creativity, and survival. You probably wouldn't last a single day in this blazing furnace without help. The thought of your modern fridge humming safely in your kitchen back home is almost comic here. 2,000 years ago, there's no plug to save you, no humming machine at the corner of a room. The only thing between you and spoiled food is the ingenuity of a people who refuse to bow to the desert. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to post your location and local time in the comments. There's something magical about seeing people all over the world tuning in together, scattered across time zones like stars in a night sky. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward in your imagination, stepping into an ancient Persian village. The heat slaps you the way a mischievous sibling might splash cold water, except, of course, it's the opposite. The earth cracks beneath your feet, little fissures like the lines of an old parchment map. Chickens dart between mud brick houses, and children sit cross-legged in the dust, fanning themselves with palm leaves. A woman carries a clay jar balanced on her hip, and the sheen of water glistening at its rim feels like treasure in this unforgiving climate. That jar, by the way, isn't just decoration, it's survival. Historians tell us that long before electricity, Persians figured out that the desert, cruel as it is by day, becomes a surprising ally at night. The temperature swings wildly. By sunset, the desert cools so fast you might even shiver, the stars blanketing the sky with a clarity that makes you dizzy. Villagers would use this shift to their advantage. They left water in shallow clay pans under the night sky, letting the dry desert air pull away the heat, sometimes even forming a delicate skin of ice. Imagine waking before dawn, slipping barefoot over the cool earth, and seeing your breath puff like mist. The villagers hurry out to gather this fragile layer of ice, precious as gold, storing it away before the sun claims it again. It's like catching fireflies. You know it won't last long, but you hold on to the magic anyway. Mainstream history likes to remind us that Persia was not just a land of kings and conquests, but also of clever problem-solving. Here in this tiny village, cooling food wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Spoiled meat meant illness. Wasted grain meant hunger. Every mouthful counted. That's why even humble pots became miniature experiments in thermodynamics, long before the word itself existed. And here's the quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Villagers often buried their food jars halfway into the ground, letting the earth act like insulation. Think of it as the world's laziest but most reliable refrigerator. You didn't need wires or coils. You just needed gravity and patience. Bread wrapped in cloth, fruit cushioned in straw, all of it pressed into little earthen coolers that doubled as storage pits. Of course, historians still argue whether the earliest attempt at refrigeration in Persia should be credited to villagers experimenting with clay jars, or to more organized efforts in cities where architects designed purpose-built structures. That debate is like an academic version of arguing over who invented pizza. Yes, everyone has an opinion, and yes, people get oddly passionate about it. But you, standing here under the blazing sun, you don't care about scholarly turf wars. You just want a sip of cool water. The jar you lift feels rough under your fingertips, clay cooled slightly by evaporation. You tilt it, and the water runs over your tongue, not icy but cooler than the air, enough to make you sigh like a cat finding shade. Somewhere in your modern mind, you joke to yourself that maybe Persians invented the first sports drink. And as you swallow, you realize this is the seed of something much bigger. These small experiments, clay jars, buried pots, overnight ice, were the first whispers of the Yakhchal, the monumental ice pit domes that would rise like mirages in the desert centuries later. But for now, you're still at the beginning of that long, sandy road. You look around the village once more, the goats bleating, the dust swirling, the children laughing through the heat, and you realize people here didn't just survive. They engineered comfort in a place where comfort seemed impossible. You walk further along the dusty lane, and the village begins to reveal itself in layers. Mud brick homes lean gently toward each other, as if conspiring to share the meager shade their walls cast. Each doorway is draped with woven mats that flutter lazily in the hot breeze. The sound of sandals scuffing against dry earth and the occasional bray of a donkey make up the local soundtrack. You can almost feel the weight of time pressing here. Centuries before refrigeration as you know it, these families wrestle with the same basic question you face when you open your fridge at midnight. How you keep food from turning bad too quickly. In the cool corners of these homes, you notice jars lined up neatly against walls. The jars are large, rounded, and porous, made from the same earth that forms the ground beneath your feet. Their walls are thick enough to hold the precious contents, grains, dried fruit, water, against the heat of the day. When you press your palm to one of them, you can feel a faint coolness radiating out. It's not magic. It's physics, even if no one in the village would use that word. The water seeps slowly through the clay and evaporates, stealing heat away and lowering the temperature inside. A crude but effective form of evaporative cooling. Mainstream history tells us that these practices were common across many early settlements, but Persia's climate made them a matter of life and death. Food spoiled quickly in the heat, and there were no giant granaries humming with modern fans. The villagers relied on this clever relationship between clay, water, and desert air to keep their harvest safe. Without it, entire families could be pushed to the edge of starvation in lean seasons. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some of these clay jars were deliberately buried up to their necks in the ground. Children would joke that the jars were like turtles hiding in their shells. Adults knew better. Of course, burial kept the contents cooler and protected them from scavenging animals. It was less a refrigerator and more of an ancient underground pantry, blending practicality with a touch of whimsy. You might imagine opening one of those jars yourself. Inside, you'd find dried apricots that still glisten with sugar, figs wrinkled and sweet, or perhaps a small pouch of salt to season the day's stew. Grain, carefully measured and tucked away, would rustle like sand as you lifted a lid. Every item stored here meant survival stretched a little longer, and every grain was guarded with the seriousness of treasure. Historians still argue whether Persia was unique in refining these methods, or whether similar tricks were being tried simultaneously in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even India. The debate rests on fragments of pottery, written accounts, and the frustrating gaps in archaeology where time has swallowed the evidence. Was Persia first, or simply the most successful at turning these small steps into monumental architecture later on? Nobody can say for certain. Those scholars continue to volley theories like a never-ending tennis match played across centuries. You, though, standing in that village, aren't concerned with academic rivalries. You crouch near the hearth of a small home, watching as a mother carefully ladles water from one jar into a smaller cup. Her children gather close, each waiting for a sip. Their faces brighten at the coolness, and for a moment, you almost taste it yourself. Simple, refreshing, like the first gulp after mowing your lawn in the modern world. The contrast between the blazing air and that tiny bit of relief feels like a blessing. And here's the funny thing. You might laugh at how much effort went into such a small victory. Imagine explaining to someone today that you celebrated because your water was only a little less hot than the desert air. Yet, in this setting, that small difference was a line between misery and endurance. Ancient life was about stacking these little victories, like building blocks, until survival felt possible. As evening falls in the village, shadows stretch longer, and the temperature finally begins to dip. Families bring out mats, spreading them in courtyards, preparing to sleep under the open sky. The clay jars remain steady guardians at the edges, their contents ready for tomorrow's meals. The stars will soon reveal themselves, brighter here than you can probably imagine from your light-polluted city. And as villagers tuck in for the night, you realize that this rhythm, the daily fight with heat, the nightly cooling of the earth, the constant storing and saving, wasn't just survival. It was the quiet heartbeat of Persian life, the first pulse of an idea that would someday grow into a Yakhchal, the desert's own refrigerator. You find yourself leaving behind the narrow lanes of that dusty village and moving toward the wider stretches of land where ingenuity begins to whisper more loudly. The air is still heavy, pressing on your shoulders, but your ears catch something unexpected, a faint trickling sound. Not a stream, not a river, but something quieter, more deliberate. You follow it until the ground dips, and there, hidden beneath a layer of earth and stone, you glimpse one of ancient Persia's most revolutionary creations, the Khanate. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, just a dark opening in the ground, ringed with rough-hewn stones. But when you kneel and peer inside, cool air brushes against your face. The sound of water running through this underground passage feels like music in the desert. Your modern brain might want to label it plumbing, but it's older, simpler, and somehow more magical. The Persians figured out that they tunneled into the foothills of nearby mountains. They could tap underground aquifers and guide water gently down toward their villages and fields. Gravity did all the work. No pumps, no motors, just clever engineering and stubborn patience. Mainstream history recognizes Khanates as one of Persia's great contributions to civilization, so important that UNESCO eventually declared them a World Heritage System. Entire cities thrived in regions where rainfall was nearly non-existent, simply because these subterranean veins delivered life drop by drop. Without them, your village would have been nothing more than a scattering of huts abandoned to the sand. Here's a quirky tidbit. Building a Khanate wasn't just practical, it was dangerous. Imagine crawling through tunnels with nothing but oil lamps and simple tools, chipping away at rock while hoping the earth wouldn't collapse on you. Workers sometimes dug vertical shafts every few meters, both to haul out soil and to let in air. From above, the desert landscape would be dotted with neat little holes, like a line of buttons stretching toward the horizon. Travelers could spot them from miles away and know, water lives here. Historians still argue whether the earliest Khanates appeared as far back as the 7th century BC, or if they emerged later, refined by generations of trial and error. Some insist the Persians borrowed ideas from neighboring Mesopotamia. Others believe Persia led the way, exporting the technology outward. The truth is murky, buried as deep as the tunnels themselves, and scholars continue to debate whose fingerprints rest on the very first Khanate. You, though, kneeling at the mouth of one, aren't concerned with academic credit. You're more impressed by the sensation of that cool breeze, a welcome contrast to the desert's daytime cruelty. Imagine being a farmer in this climate, seeing green wheat sprout from a field that should have been lifeless dust. You'd whisper thanks to whoever dared to tunnel into rock, just so your children could eat. And here's where the connection to refrigeration begins to sparkle. With water flowing underground, the Persians had a steady, cooler supply to work with. They learned to combine the Earth's natural insulation with clever architecture, setting the stage for ice storage and preservation techniques that seemed almost miraculous. Picture villagers channeling this water into shallow basins, letting the night air freeze it, and then hauling those frozen slabs into pits kept cold by both Earth and engineering. It's almost funny when you think about it. Modern refrigerators rely on compressors, coils, and humming fans. The Persians relied on holes in the ground. And yet, both serve the same need. You want your leftovers, whether it's roasted lamb or last night's pizza, to still taste edible tomorrow. Human priorities haven't changed much. Only the tools have. As you lean back from the Khanate's opening, wiping a bit of dust from your face, you realize the brilliance wasn't just in building it. It was in maintaining it for centuries. Entire professions existed around keeping these underground channels clear, repairing collapses, ensuring flow. Some Khanates, believe it or not, still carry water today, a living link between past and present. Imagine drinking from one and realizing you're tasting the same underground supply that farmers did 2,000 years ago. And if you chuckle at the thought of ancient people inventing something that feels like a giant straw stuck into the earth, you wouldn't be far off. Except the straw didn't drain recklessly. It balanced use with sustainability, an idea modern cities sometimes struggle with. You straighten up, dust clinging to your clothes, and gaze back across the shimmering horizon. Those quiet, dark Khanates running beneath your feet are like the arteries of a civilization. Without them, No cooling, no ice, no grand Yakhchals could ever have existed. They're the hidden foundation, the unseen miracle, the reason that, centuries later, you'll find yourself standing before a massive dome rising from the desert floor, chilled air wafting from within. You rise from the edge of that shadowy canet, brushing grit off your hands, and lift your gaze toward the hazy horizon. In the distance, you imagine another scene unfolding. A procession of men and mules descending from the mountains, their backs bent beneath enormous loads wrapped in straw and cloth. The air here is just as hot, but the bundles they carry are anything but ordinary. They are blocks of ice, carved from frozen mountain streams during the coldest months, now brought down to the villages below. You trail after them in your imagination, feeling the ache in your legs as the path twists downward. The smell of pine needles and snow still lingers on these loads, though the further they travel, the more the desert tries to lick that coolness away. Every step matters. The men grunt, pause to wipe their brows, then shoulder the weight again, determined not to waste a single sliver. Imagine the pressure. One careless slip and a block of ice might tumble, shatter, and melt into nothing more than mud. Mainstream history records that Persians were among the first to establish organized systems of transporting ice from mountain to settlement. This wasn't just convenience. It was cultural and economic prestige. Imagine offering guests chilled drinks in a place where most people barely survive the midday heat. That was luxury defined. Kings and nobles used this imported ice to make sorbets called faloodeh, laced with rose water and thin noodles, a treat so refreshing it still exists in Iranian cuisine today. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages had what you might call ice guards, men tasked with protecting these precious blocks on their journey. Why? Because bandits didn't only steal gold or spices. Sometimes they stole ice. The thought of someone robbing you for a frozen chunk might sound like the setup to a bad joke, but in the desert, ice was practically currency. A thief with a fast horse could sell a stolen block for food, water, or favors in the next town. Historians still argue whether this system of mountain ice hauling began as early as the Achaemenid Empire, or it became widespread only in later centuries. Some suggest it was mainly for the elite, while others claim even modest villages got their share. The lack of detailed records leaves room for endless debate. But whichever side you take, the image of weary men guiding their sweating donkeys down rocky trails with melting blocks tied to their backs is vivid enough. You step closer in your mind, running your hand along one of those bundle loads. It's slick cold, shockingly out of place against the blazing air. For a moment, you press your cheek against it, laughing softly at the absurdity. You feel like a desert wanderer who stumbled into a freezer aisle by mistake. And yes, you're probably thinking the same thing. Ice cream on a hot day. Apparently, that craving is as old as civilization itself. But here's where the humor of the moment fades into awe. These efforts, hauling ice, guarding it, storing it, were the foundation of a system that led to Persia's great cooling structures. You begin to see the logic. Combine mountain ice with underground pits, with canets, with clay jars, and suddenly you're looking at a civilization that refused to accept the desert's terms. They bent the climate to their will, one block of frozen water at a time. Imagine the villagers watching the procession arrive. Children squeal with delight, running barefoot alongside the mules. Women clap their hands, their faces glowing with anticipation. The men unload the blocks into shaded pits, layering straw and sawdust around them like blankets. Everyone knows this resource must last until the next winter. One block wasted is a season lost. And here's a funny modern aside. If you've ever had your groceries delivered with one of those little ice packs, think of this as the ancient Persian version. Except instead of a polite delivery driver handing you a bag, you get a sweating donkey and a caravan of exhausted men trudging down the mountain. Still, the result is the same. You get cold storage and you're grateful. As the sun dips lower, the last of the blocks are packed away. The villagers stand quietly for a moment, almost reverent. These chunks of mountain are more than frozen water. They are promises. Promises of fresh fruit, safe food, and cool drinks in the scorching months to come. You exhale with them, imagining how miraculous it must have felt to taste a mountain in the middle of the desert. You linger near the village square as the last of the mule caravan disappears into the distance. But your attention shifts toward a different ritual. A group of men, wrapped in coarse tunics, are digging with steady rhythm, their shovels slicing into dry earth. Dust swirls around them, and every strike of metal against soil echoes like a drumbeat. You realize they are preparing seasonal ice pits, deep cavities that will cradle those mountain blocks through the long summer months. You shuffle closer, squinting down into the growing pit. The workers dig not randomly, but with precision, shaping the hole into a cone that widens at the bottom. The depth will shield the ice from sunlight, while the sloped walls will help the cold air settle like water in a basin. The smell of earth becomes richer the deeper they dig, and soon the air near the bottom feels faintly cooler. You imagine sliding down into that pit yourself, savoring the relief, even if you know it's temporary. Mainstream history points out that Persians were masters at exploiting natural insulation. These pits weren't just holes. They were engineered with foresight. Workers lined the walls a mixture of clay, sand, and sometimes even straw or ash to keep moisture out. Once the pit was ready, they layered the ice with sawdust or reed mats to prevent melting. The blocks lasted months, an astonishing feat in a place where daytime heat could roast bread left in the sun. Here's the quirky tidbit you probably didn't expect. Villagers sometimes held small ceremonies when sealing these pits. They sang blessings over the stored ice, as if the cold itself were a sacred guest. Children tossed flowers onto the last block before it was covered, giggling and whispering that the ice was going to sleep. It sounds whimsical, but it reflected how precious this frozen treasure really was. Historians still argue whether these pits were communal, shared by the whole village, or if they were privately owned by wealthy families who controlled access. Some evidence suggests that both models existed side by side, depending on the prosperity of the settlement. Was ice a democratic luxury or a status symbol? The records leave room for interpretation, and scholars happily debate across journals and conferences. You, though, are less interested in politics and more fascinated by the sensory experience. Imagine leaning into the pit, hearing your own voice echo off the dampened walls. You run your hand across the lining. It's rough, earthy, flecked with straw. You smell the faint sweetness of sawdust layered between blocks, almost like the scent of a carpenter's workshop. Each slab of ice rests like a sleeping beast, cold vapor curling faintly from the surface. And yes, your modern brain is already making jokes. You think of the last time you crammed too many frozen pizzas into your freezer, then had to slam the door shut before they slid back out. The Persians were doing the same balancing act, except instead of pizza, it was their survival. And instead of a freezer door, they used mud, straw, and prayer. As the workers finish, they cover the pit with heavy planks and layers of earth, disguising it from both the sun and potential thieves. The ground looks almost ordinary now, but you know that beneath your feet lies a hidden bank of winter, guarded like treasure. Villagers will return in weeks or months, lift the cover, and marvel at the miracle, ice still intact in the belly of the desert. The sun begins to set, painting the sky with streaks of copper and rose. The workers wipe their brows, leaning on their shovels. Their faces are tired but satisfied, knowing they've trapped a piece of winter for future use. And you, standing nearby, can't help but smile. You've just witnessed one more step in Persia's long, patient journey toward the invention of the Yakhchal. Each jar, each cannet, each mountain block, each pit, they're like puzzle pieces clicking together, building a legacy that endures even now. You rise from the edge of that freshly sealed ice pit, dusting your hands as if you were part crew yourself, and wander toward the outskirts of the settlement. The land opens up wide and unbroken, but there, jutting against the horizon, you see something that looks almost unreal. A dome, massive and pale, rises out of the earth like the shell of a sleeping giant. Its curves gleam faintly in the evening light, smooth and deliberate, tapering into a sharp point that seems to pierce the desert sky. You're looking at a Yakhchal, one of Persia's greatest inventions, the world's first purpose-built refrigerator. You step closer, craning your neck as the scale overwhelms you. The structure towers above the surrounding homes, its beehive shape almost alien in the flat expanse. Children chase each other around its base, their laughter echoing against the walls, while a merchant leans idly on his staff, nodding at you with pride. This isn't just storage. It's architecture that carries both function and symbolism. Mainstream history tells us that Yakhchals date back as early as 400 BCE, masterpieces of passive cooling that allowed Persians to store ice year-round. The outer walls were built with a special mortar called saruj, a mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, lime, and ash that was not only waterproof but incredibly insulating. The combination of thick walls and clever design meant the interior stayed cool even while the desert outside boiled. Here's a quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle. Saruj was so tough and resilient that some locals joked it could survive a flood, a fire, and probably your neighbor's nosy mother-in-law too. And centuries later, archaeologists still marvel at how little these domes have crumbled. A construction recipe with goat hair and egg whites outlasted empires. Who knew your omelet could double as high-tech cement? Historians still argue whether the earliest Yakhchals were strictly used for storing ice, or they also doubled as cold storage for perishable foods like dairy, fruits, and meat. Some scholars claim the structures were seasonal ice houses. Others insist they were year-round pantries. The lack of definitive records leaves the question open, and researchers trade theories like merchants bartering over spices. You, though, care less about the scholarly squabbles and more about the sensory awe of standing here. You run your hand along the wall, warm to the touch on the outside, but when you press your ear against it, you feel the faint chill emanating from within. The dome's height isn't just for show. The design funnels hot air upward, while cooler air sinks toward the storage chamber below. It's the desert's version of air conditioning, minus the electric bill. The entrance is low and narrow, and you duck your head as you step inside. Instantly, the temperature drops. The air is heavy but cool, carrying the earthy scent of clay and stored ice. You exhale in relief, your skin prickling at the sudden contrast. It's the kind of chill that feels luxurious in a place where the sun feels like a hammer. You can almost imagine ancient Persians doing the same, stepping inside after a blistering day, sighing with gratitude, and maybe sneaking a handful of chilled grapes from a basket. And here's your lighthearted moment. If you've ever opened your fridge at midnight just to cool your face and think about life's mistakes, well, congratulations! You and a 5th century BCE Persian just bonded. Different eras, same instincts. Around you, the vaulted ceilings loom high, directing heat upward while casting deep shadows below. The sound of your footsteps echoes softly, reminding you that this space wasn't built for show. It was built to last, to preserve, to defy the sun. Families, traders, even rulers depended on what was stored here. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about stability, status, and survival. You step back outside into the twilight, where the dome glows softly against the indigo sky. It looks like both a fortress and a sculpture, a testament to the strange and wonderful truth that humans, in every age, are too stubborn to accept the limits of nature. And as the desert night cools, you realize this Yakhchal isn't just a building. It's a promise, a legacy, a monument to ingenuity that whispers across millennia. You linger near the Yakhchal, circling its rounded base with curiosity, and your hand brushes against its rough surface. Up close, you notice the texture is far from smooth. Embedded in the mortar are tiny strands of goat hair, specks of ash, and flecks of straw, all fused into the clay like a recipe that belongs more in a kitchen than in architecture. It's saruj, the miracle material of the Persians, and it's tougher than it looks. You press your palm against it and realize the wall is almost 2 meters thick, a fortress against both heat and time. Mainstream history tells us saruj was designed to be both water-resistant and insulating. In a land where seasonal floods occasionally swept through low valleys and summer heat could scorch you senseless, this combination was genius. The mixture was applied in thick layers, tamped down until it hardened like stone. Once cured, it resisted not only water, but also the slow erosion of centuries. Even now, some Yakhchals still stand proud. Their saruj shells defying the elements long after the hands that built them turned to dust. Here's a quirky tidbit. The recipe for saruj was so prized that masons treated it like a family secret. Apprentices had to memorize the exact proportions of ash, lime, sand, and goat hair by heart. No written instructions, only oral tradition. Imagine being told, "Forget your multiplication tables, kid. If you can't remember the ratio of lime to clay, you're out of the guild." Historians still joke that ancient construction crews were the world's first protectors of intellectual property. Yet, scholars continue to debate just how effective Saruj really was. Some argue the walls kept the interior of the Yakhchal at near constant cool temperatures, while others believe the insulation was only partial, requiring frequent replenishment of ice. Archaeological studies offer conflicting evidence, and the numbers don't always match the oral traditions. So, the question lingers, was Saruj a miracle or merely adequate? No consensus, just polite academic bickering over ancient cement. You crouch and press your ear against the wall. It hums faintly, almost like a seashell. That's just your imagination, of course, but it makes you smile. You picture the workers mixing the mortar centuries ago, stamping it into place with bare feet, their laughter echoing as they joked about whose goat hair was best. The scent of lime and wet clay would have filled the air, clinging to their skin until evening. As you step back, you realize the genius of Saruj lies in its simplicity. It didn't rely on imported materials or complex tools, just local resources used with precision. The desert provided clay and sand. The herds provided hair. The hearth provided ash, and the hens gave up their egg whites. Yes, even breakfast went into the making of this dome. If that doesn't make you smirk, picture a mason cracking eggs into a bucket, not for an omelet, but for cement. Somewhere, a Persian child probably complained, "But I wanted those eggs for breakfast." Inside the Yakhchal, you sense the difference this mortar made. The air doesn't feel damp or moldy. It's cool and steady. The walls don't sweat. They breathe just enough to balance humidity. You touch the inside surface and find it smoother, polished with care, as if the builders knew this wasn't just storage. It was a community's treasure chest. Stepping back into the dusk, you look up once more. The Yakhchal looms with quiet dignity, its walls glowing pale under the fading sun. You realize that each strand of goat hair, each spoonful of ash, was part of a collective act of defiance. Together, they turned fragile materials into something monumental. And in that moment, you find yourself admiring not just the brilliance of Persian engineering, but the stubborn humanity of it. People willing to throw breakfast ingredients into cement if it meant keeping their children cool. You tilt your head back and trace the graceful slope of the dome until your eyes rest on the summit, where the Yakhchal narrows to a single point stabbing the sky. The design is hypnotic. Soaring curves guiding your gaze upward, as though the building itself is teaching you to look past the heat and into the cool promise hidden within. You step inside again, letting your feet echo softly against the packed earth floor, and you realize this isn't just storage. It's architecture designed to dance with air. The vaulted ceilings above you form arches that feel both protective and elegant. Each curve pulls hot air upward, coaxing it to rise like smoke while heavier. Cooler air sinks and settles near the ice and provision store below. It's basic convection, though the Persians didn't use the term. They simply knew it worked. Step into the center of the dome, and you can actually feel the difference. Your breath escapes warm, but the air that brushes your ankles feels a whisper cooler. Mainstream history recognizes these vaulted spaces as vital elements of Persian architecture. You'll find similar arches in mosques, bazaars, and palaces, but in the Yakhchal, they serve an almost invisible function, moving air, silently keeping things fresh. In a land where heat ruled every day, this quiet trick of design gave people the upper hand. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Yakhchals were built with hidden staircases winding inside their walls. Imagine villagers slipping along these narrow, shadowed paths to reach the deeper chambers without disturbing the fragile balance of air. Children probably turned them into playgrounds when no one was looking, racing up and down until a stern elder shooed them away. You can almost hear the laughter bouncing off the arches, mingling with the hushed coolness. Historians still argue whether the Persian builders designed these arches primarily for airflow or whether their shape was more symbolic, echoing religious or cultural ideals. Were they engineers first and artists second, or the other way around? The evidence is scattered, leaving room for debate. Some scholars insist the curves mirror cosmological beliefs, while others dismiss such theories as reading too much into simple geometry. You, standing here, don't worry about theories. You focus on the sensory poetry of it. Your eyes follow lines of shadows sliding along the curved walls, like paint strokes brushed by the sun through the entrance. You hear the faint rustle of air moving above, almost like a sigh, and you notice how the acoustics change with each step. The echo stretching longer under one arch, tighter under another, a reminder that sound and air obey the same invisible rules. And of course, your modern sense of humor sneaks in. You mutter under your breath. So, basically, this is ancient air conditioning minus the noisy fan that rattles at 2 a.m. You imagine a Persian engineer proudly patting the wall, saying, "See? No electricity bill. Ever." Somewhere, you can almost hear an ancestor laughing at your comparison. You picture daily life inside. Families stepping to the low entrance, lowering baskets into the storage pit, the vaulted ceilings arching over them like guardians. A merchant lifts a cloth to reveal chilled fruit for his trade caravan, nodding in satisfaction. Children crouch, giggling, as they dare each other to breathe the coldest air near the base. Each curve of the ceiling watches silently, keeping heat and chaos outside. As you finally step out again, the evening stars have begun to emerge, tiny pinpricks scattered across the deepening blue. The dome glows faintly under their light, its arches hidden inside, but still working tirelessly, moving air in invisible patterns. You realize the structure isn't static. It's alive in its own way, breathing through curves, exhaling heat, inhaling coolness. A sleeping giant, its vaulted lungs rising and falling with the rhythm of the desert itself. You take one more step into the dome's shadow, and this time your mind drifts to the subtler forces at play. The invisible chemistry of air and water that the Persians somehow mastered long before thermodynamics became a word. You crouch by a shallow basin at the base of the Yakhchal, dipping your hand into a thin layer of water that glistens faintly there. When you lift your fingers, the droplets vanish almost instantly, stolen by the arid desert breeze. And that, right there, is the trick: evaporative cooling. Mainstream history explains it simply. When water evaporates, it absorbs heat from its surroundings. In the desert's low humidity, the effect is dramatic. The Persians didn't need textbooks or lab coats. They just paid attention. Leave a jar of water in the open air, and it cools itself. Channel breezes across a wet surface, and suddenly you've got air that feels refreshingly crisp, even if the sun is glaring overhead. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households kept porous clay pitchers, called zayers, on their rooftops. These jars sweated water through their surfaces, creating a constant chill. Travelers wrote about sipping from them and marveling at how much cooler the water was compared to the air. And in a way, those humble jars were like miniature Yakhchals, personal fridges before fridges existed. You can almost picture a villager proudly offering you a drink from one, saying, "Yes, it's cold. No, we don't need electricity. Sit down and stop asking questions." Historians still argue whether the Persians discovered this through trial and error, or whether they borrowed the concept from earlier Mesopotamian and Egyptian practices. Clay vessels for cooling existed elsewhere, but scaling the principle up into vast structures like the Yakhchal seems uniquely Persian. Did they innovate or did they perfect? The jury's still out, and the debate trickles on like water through sand. You wander deeper inside, letting the desert night wind slip through a narrow vent above. As it passes over damp surfaces, you feel the temperature shift, like stepping into a shaded courtyard after walking across open sand. It's subtle, but in this climate, subtlety is salvation. Imagine how the villagers must have savored this. Bread dough kneaded with water that wasn't lukewarm, fruit that stayed sweet instead of fermenting, water that quenched instead of cloying. Of course, you can't resist making the modern comparison. You chuckle to yourself. So basically, the Persians hacked the same principle as those misting fans in theme parks, except their version didn't charge $8 for bottled water on the side. You can almost see a Persian mason raising an eyebrow at you, muttering, "We invented this centuries ago, and you still think it's new?" The air inside grows quiet, broken only by the faint trickle from the cannon-fed basin. You close your eyes, and it feels as though the dome itself is breathing. Warm air drifting up, cooler air sinking down, water vanishing only to leave comfort in its wake. In this simple cycle lies the essence of Persian refrigeration: patience, observation, and a willingness to use nature's quirks instead of fighting them. Stepping back outside, the desert night has fully arrived. Stars crowd the sky, and a soft breeze rustles across the sand. The Yakhchal looms behind you, its curved walls silently at work, harnessing evaporation the way a musician coaxes melody from silence. And as you glance back once more, you realize this wasn't just survival. It was science wrapped in clay, a cool whisper in a land of heat. You wander a little farther from the Yakhchal, letting the desert wind brush your face, and your eyes catch something curious. Rising from rooftops like stone sails are tall, narrow towers with open mouths facing the horizon. They look almost like chimneys turned upside down, and yet when you step closer, you hear not smoke rushing out, but wind being pulled in. These are badgers, or wind catchers, another Persian stroke of genius. You pause beneath one, craning your neck as its shadow stretches across the courtyard. The air that drifts down through its shaft feels different, cooler, steadier, as though the tower itself is taming the desert breeze. Families sit beneath it, spreading mats on the floor, their faces relaxed in relief. Without fans, without switches, the badger funnels passing gust down into living spaces and storage rooms, keeping the heat at bay. Mainstream history recognizes these wind catchers as one of the oldest known forms of natural ventilation, a technology that spread across the Middle East and beyond. Some versions directed air over underground water channels or pools, enhancing the cooling through evaporation before sending it into homes. You realize the brilliance. A simple tower that turned unpredictable desert winds into loyal servants. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some towns built competitions around these wind catchers. Families brag about whose tower could catch the faintest breeze or keep milk cooler for longer. Imagine neighborhood kids daring each other to climb up the towers, only get stuck halfway and need rescuing. Half adventure, half scolding from parents. Even in innovation, human mischief never really changes. Historians still argue whether badgers originated in Persia or if they first appeared in Egypt, where similar towers dotted early settlements. The evidence overlaps, leading to polite but endless debates at academic conferences. Was it a Persian export to Egypt or the other way around? No one can fully prove it, though both regions clearly refine the design. Scholars, as usual, seem more heated about airflow than the airflow itself. You lean against the base of one tower, listening to the air whisper as it descends. It's not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like the soft sigh of a sleeping child. That's the magic. In a climate where wind usually feels like an oven door swinging open, these towers transformed it into a cooling balm. And inside the Yakhchals, badgers worked hand in hand with vaulted ceilings and evaporative pools, amplifying their effectiveness. It was an orchestra design, each instrument playing its part without needing a conductor. You can't resist comparing it to your modern world. You chuckle quietly. So, let me get this straight. Centuries before central air conditioning, Persians had skyscraper-sized funnels catching wind and pumping cool air through their houses. And here I am, still arguing with my electric fan that only points in two directions. If irony had a thermostat, it would wink at you right now. As night deepens, you picture the scene inside a nobleman's home. Servants set out trays of fruit cooled by the Yakhchal, while breezes guided by badgers drift across the courtyard. Oil lamps flicker, their flames dancing but not faltering in the steady draft. Guests recline on cushions, sipping rose water, remarking how pleasant the evening feels. And you realize this was more than comfort. It was a performance of sophistication, proof that Persia could command both earth and air. Standing under the tall silhouette of the tower, you tilt your head back once more. The open mouth of the badger stares into the star-filled sky, catching not just wind but imagination. You exhale slowly, letting the cooled air brush across your cheeks, and think, the Persians weren't just building towers. They were building serenity out of chaos, inviting the desert itself to be an ally. You leave the windcatcher's shadow and return to the Yakhchal, slipping through its low doorway once again. The air greets you with that quiet, earthy coolness, and this time you notice what lies within. Stacks of ice blocks, neatly arranged along the walls, their surfaces glistening faintly in the dim light. You crouch beside them, brushing your hand across one slab. It bites back, sharp and cold, as though it wants to remind you just how miraculous its presence here truly is. Mainstream history records that Persians stored ice in layers, packing each block with straw or sawdust to keep it insulated and separate. The storage chambers at the bottom of the Yakhchal were dug deep, sometimes several meters underground, ensuring the cold stayed trapped. In this way, entire communities could rely on these frozen reserves through the hottest months, even stretching into autumn when the desert still sweltered. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families mark their ice blocks with painted symbols or simple carvings, like branding cattle, to make sure no one accidentally took more than their share. Imagine a child sneaking into the chamber for a stolen chunk of ice, only to be caught red-handed because the block bore Uncle Hossein's distinctive flower mark. Ice theft? What a strangely specific crime to worry about. Historians still argue about the efficiency of these chambers. Some scholars suggest the Yakhchals preserved ice almost perfectly through the summer, while others claim significant melting required constant replenishment. The truth is probably somewhere in between, depending on the quality of construction and the vigilance of the community. The debate lingers like a draft inside the dome. Was this near perfection, or just good enough? You picture daily life here. At dawn, workers open the chamber door, their footsteps echoing as they descend the packed earth ramp. They haul out chunks of ice, wrap them in cloth, and deliver them across the village. A baker gets his share for kneading dough with cool water. A merchant buys a block to chill fruit before sending it on a caravan. A noble family servant rushes back to the palace with slabs destined for sherbet bowls. Each use ripples outward, shaping the rhythm of everyday survival. And you, still crouched near that icy wall, can't help but make a modern comparison. You laugh softly to yourself. Imagine ancient Persia with an HOA meeting, arguing over whose block of ice dripped onto whose straw mat. The comedy writes itself, but behind the humor, you know this storage chamber was serious business. Without it, the village's carefully harvested winter supply would vanish long before it was needed. You straighten and glance upward. The vaulted dome above seems to hover like a guardian, keeping the chamber in shadow, its curves shuttling heat away while protecting the cold horde. It's strangely poetic, an entire building working as one giant refrigerator, humming without a sound. You can almost feel the pride of the builders lingering here, as if their fingerprints remain pressed into every cooled stone. You breathe in deeply. The air smells faintly of straw, clay, and that sharp metallic tang that ice sometimes carries. Closing your eyes, you can almost hear the bustling voices of villagers as they fetch their daily rations. Their laughter, their arguments, their whispered thanks, all absorbed by these walls. The ice chamber was more than storage. It was a lifeline, a gathering point, a quiet miracle carved from persistence. You step away from the stacked blocks, wandering deeper into the cool belly of the Yakhchal, where niches carved into the wall hold large clay jars. They stand in neat rows, some capped with woven lids, others sealed with hardened wax. You lean in curious and brush dust from the shoulder of one jar. It feels smooth and slightly damp, and when you lift the lid, a faint chill rises to meet your face. Inside rests water, clear, shimmering, and blessedly cold. Mainstream history tells us that storing water in these clay vessels wasn't just about preservation, but about comfort. The porous walls of the jars allowed slow evaporation, which kept the contents cooler than the surrounding air. Travelers wrote of Persian water that tasted as if it had been drawn from a mountain spring, even when the well it came from was miles away. For ordinary families, sipping from these jars was a small daily luxury, one that softened the hardship of desert life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some jars were shaped with long, narrow necks and rounded bellies, designed so that when you poured water into a cup, it made a gurgling sound. Children loved this noise, calling the jars laughing pots. Adults probably rolled their eyes, but smiled anyway, knowing the sound meant their drink would be refreshingly cool. You can almost hear it now, a cheerful burble echoing inside the dome. Historians still argue whether these vessels were mainly for drinking water or whether they doubled as primitive refrigerators for perishables, dairy, fruits, even early syrups made from mulberries or dates. Some accounts describe villagers retrieving chilled yogurt or sour milk, while others dismiss this as exaggeration. Was it truly refrigeration, or just wishful memory recorded centuries later? The debate, like so many, remains unresolved. You crouch and lift one jar with both hands. The clay is surprisingly heavy, and tiny droplets beat on its surface. Cool against your skin. You tilt it carefully, filling a shallow cup. The first sip is sharp, almost startling, compared to the heavy warmth of the desert. The water rolls across your tongue, carrying a faint mineral tang that makes you smack your lips. You sigh audibly, and for a moment, you wonder if the sensation, the shock of cold water against heat, was one of the most universal joys of ancient life. And of course, your modern mind cracks a joke. So, basically, the world's first water cooler minus the gossip about Brendan accounting. You grin at the thought of ancient Persians gathering here, sipping chilled water and trading stories about crops, caravans, and who owed whom a goat. Some things never change. Refreshments always bring conversation. You glance around the chamber and imagine the rhythm of daily use. A young boy padding in with bare feet, balancing a jar against his chest, straining to carry it to his family's home. A baker dipping his ladle for enough water to knead dough, grateful the heat hasn't spoiled the supply. A merchant pouring cool water into a traveler's cup, earning a coin and a grateful smile. Every jar, every sip, a reminder how the Yakhchal's miracle rippled outward into daily life. Stepping back toward the entrance, you pause to set your jar down. The air brushes cool across your cheek, whispering that this is more than storage. These vessels, humble as they seem, are the personal face of a grand invention. The moment when engineering touches your lips and you taste ingenuity itself. You ease back into the open courtyard, leaving behind the jars and the echoing chamber, and you notice how life gathers naturally around the Yakhchal. Families spread woven mats in the cool shadow it casts. Neighbors linger nearby with baskets of fruit, and the faint sound of lute drifts lazily through the evening air. It isn't just a building. It's a community magnet where cooling meets conversation. You settle yourself on the edge of a mat, watching as a woman slices open a melon. The knife slides to the pale green flesh, and when she passes you a piece, the first bite nearly startles you. The fruit is chilled crisp, a refreshing contrast against the desert's heavy breath. Mainstream history records that Persians delighted in cooling food and drink, using ice or cold water to elevate ordinary meals. Chilled fruit, sherbets flavored with rose water, even wine stored near the Yakhchal, all were part of culture that learned how to turn the unbearable heat into a stage for luxury. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families actually kept small clay bowls buried near the Yakhchal's base, each one filled with slices of melon, grapes, or cucumbers. Children were sent scurrying to fetch them during meals, a kind of early version of grabbing snacks from the fridge. You can almost hear a Persian parent sighing, "Don't eat it all on the way back," knowing full well a few pieces would mysteriously vanish before reaching the table. Historians still argue whether this communal sharing was universal across Persian society or mostly confined to urban centers and wealthier households. Did every villager get to enjoy chilled melon, or was it mostly a noble's treat? The archaeological evidence is thin, leaving scholars to squabble politely. Some argue that descriptions of lavish feasts skew our picture, while others insist that even modest homes access small luxuries thanks to shared storage. You lean back, the sweetness of melon lingering on your tongue, and watch the gathering unfold. Men exchange gossip about caravan prices. Women compare notes on weaving patterns, and children laugh as they chase each other around the dome's base. The air carries the faint perfume of rose petals scattered in water bowls, a tradition meant to cool both the senses and the spirit. In this moment, the Yakhchal isn't just engineering, it's the quiet heart of village life, holding people together as much as it holds ice. Your modern brain, of course, can't resist a wry thought. You chuckle softly. So, basically, the Yakhchal was the ancient equivalent of a water cooler at work, except instead of office gossip about weekend plans, you get serious debates about who still owes a sheep. Some forms of community never really change. Only the details shift. As the sun finally dips, shadows stretch long and the desert cools into night. Families linger a little longer, savoring the relief before returning to their homes. You stand and glance back at the dome, realizing that it isn't just an object of architecture. It's a stage for human connection, where survival and joy intersect. Every shared sip, every slice of cold melon, every whispered laugh was amplified by the simple miracle of stored coolness. You exhale deeply, letting the night air fill your lungs. Around you, the hum of conversation quiets, replaced by the crackle of small fires and the distant calls of night birds. And you know, the Yakhchal wasn't merely preserving ice. It was preserving something far more fragile, the warmth of community, paradoxically nurtured by the cold. You wander through the village the next morning, when the sun is already flexing its strength, and your attention shifts from the communal chatter of families to the bustling stalls of merchants. The market hums with energy, spices piled into pyramids, textiles unfurled in waves of color, jars of honey glinting in the light. But behind the fragrances and the noise, you notice a quieter detail. Some goods are tucked into clay basins filled with cold water or stored in shaded niches lined with straw. The merchants, too, depend on the Yakhchal. Mainstream history tells us that cooling technology wasn't just for comfort. It had real economic weight. Persia sat at the crossroads of trade routes stretching across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Goods like saffron, silk, and dried fruits fetched high prices, but only if they arrived in good condition. The ability to store perishables safely gave Persian traders an advantage. Ice and cool storage meant merchants could keep saffron fresh, grapes edible, and dairy less spoiled before sending them along caravans. Cooling wasn't just survival, it was profit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some merchants reportedly stored rose water in chilled containers before bottling it for export. Buyers in distant cities believed the fragrance lasted longer if the liquid was born cold. Was that true? Probably not entirely. But clever marketing has existed since the first person tried to sell something. You can imagine a Persian trader proudly boasting, "Our rose water has mountain frost in its veins." Historians still argue over how much of Persia's trade advantage came from these storage methods versus its political dominance along the Silk Road. Was the empire's success built on sheer geography, or did technologies like the Yakhchal give them an extra edge? The debate endures, with scholars trading theories as busily as merchants traded goods. You stroll deeper into the market, inhaling the scent of cardamom and pomegranates. A merchant offers you a chilled fig, the flesh bursting sweet and juicy in your mouth. He grins, knowing that one cool bite will linger longer in your memory than all the rugs and trinkets combined. For him, ice isn't just preservation, it's persuasion. It's the little flourish that makes customers return. And of course, you can't help comparing it to modern times. You smile at the thought. So, basically, this is the ancient version of supermarkets missed in the lettuce aisle just to make it look fresh. The marketing trick is the same, only the tools have changed. You picture a Persian merchant, standing smugly behind his wares, thinking, if the customer tastes cool fruit in a desert, they'll never forget it. Around you, trade hums on. Camels kneel, ready to carry loads eastward toward India, westward toward the Mediterranean. Men haggle loudly. Children chase chickens between stalls, and above it all, the Yakhchal looms in the distance, quietly keeping its treasure safe until the merchants return for more. You realize how deeply this cooling technology was woven into the economy. Every chilled fruit and fresh-smelling jar of saffron represented not just clever storage, but the prosperity of an empire. You step aside, leaning against a shaded wall, and let the rhythm of the market wash over you. Coins clink, voices rise and fall, and the desert sun beats down, but the goods remain fresh, preserved by a dome of clay and ingenuity. And you understand, the Yakhchal wasn't just a tool of survival or comfort. It was a silent partner in trade, ensuring that Persia's wealth flowed as surely as the cannons beneath its soil. You drift away from the noisy clamor of the market, your sandals crunching over the dusty path, and soon you find yourself in a quieter quarter near a small temple. Here, the scent of incense lingers, sweet and smoky, curling upward like lazy ribbons. The priests in their pale robes move deliberately, tending to lamps and whispering prayers. And in the corner of the courtyard, you notice something unexpected. A basin of water kept cool beneath a canopy, its surface shimmering faintly in the shadow. Even here, at the threshold of the sacred, the logic of preservation makes its quiet appearance. Mainstream history reminds us that in many cultures, purity and preservation often went hand in hand. Cold water and stored ice weren't just practical. They carried symbolic meaning. In Zoroastrian traditions, purity of elements was central, and water especially was seen as sacred. Keeping it clear, clean, and even cool became a reflection of spiritual devotion. Imagine a priest lifting a ladle of chilled water during a ritual, its freshness reinforcing the idea of divine purity. The act was both refreshment and reverence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that young initiates joked about the gods preferring cool offerings over warm ones, teasing each other as they fetched water from storage pits near temples. Was it blasphemy or just youthful humor? Hard to say, but even in devotion, people never quite lose their knack for joking. You can almost hear a young acolyte muttering, "The gods won't drink lukewarm water. Better hurry to the Yakhchal." Historians still argue whether the link between cold storage and religion was formalized doctrine or simply a cultural overlap. Were the priests consciously weaving technology into symbolism, or did it happen naturally as communities used what they had at hand? Some scholars point to texts hinting at ritual purity tied to chilled water, while others dismiss it as later exaggeration. The ambiguity leaves room for debate, as most things in ancient history do. You settle onto the cool stone steps, watching the slow procession of worshippers. Some pause to sip from a shared cup of water, pressing their foreheads against the rim before passing it on. Others wash their hands and faces, the chilled liquid drawing relieved sighs. You notice how different it feels here. The same technology that kept fruit fresh in the market is now woven into ritual, giving spiritual weight to the sensation of coldness in a land dominated by heat. And of course, you can't resist a modern aside. You smile wryly. So basically, the priests were running the original version of a chilled water dispenser at a yoga studio, except instead of scented towels, you got divine purity. The blend of sacred and practical feels both timeless and oddly familiar. As the chants continue, the basin glints softly, its ripples catching the candlelight. You realize the Yakhchal wasn't just a machine of survival or a partner in trade. It also became a metaphor, a symbol of purity and protection. Cold water wasn't only a physical blessing. It was a spiritual one too, reminding people that even in the desert, clarity and renewal could be preserved. You close your eyes, letting the faint chant wash over you. The breeze carries the coolness from the basin across your face, and for a moment, it feels like more than physics. It feels like grace. You leave the temple courtyard behind, stepping into the shaded lanes that lead toward a grand residence. The air feels heavier here, scented with rose petals and grilled lamb drifting from distant kitchens. Servants bustle about, carrying trays and pitchers, and the clink of copper bowls echoes faintly. You arrive at a noble household, where the luxuries of Persia truly unfold. And once again, the Yakhchal makes its subtle entrance, not as survival, but as indulgence. Inside the palace garden, you see channels of water trickling through carved stone troughs, feeding small pools where lotus flowers float lazily. Cushions are scattered beneath the shade of pomegranate trees, and noblemen recline with goblets in hand. The liquid inside isn't just wine or sherbet, it's chilled, frosty even, thanks to the ice haul from mountaintops or reserved in the Yakhchal's chambers. Mainstream history notes that Persian elites used their access to cold storage as a marker of status. To offer a guest chilled rose water on a scorching day wasn't only hospitality, it was a declaration of power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Court poets often compared chilled drinks to love itself. One line describes sherbet so cold it burns sweetly as passion. Another likens a shock of coolness to the sudden glance of a beloved across a crowded room. Imagine reciting that while sipping iced pomegranate juice. Poetry meet popsicle. Historians still argue whether such luxuries were truly widespread among the nobility or reserved for the rarest feasts. Some claim sherbets and chilled fruits were common enough in royal courts, while others suggest only the highest elite enjoyed them, making every icy sip an extravagance. The evidence, fragment of poetry, mentions in travelers' accounts, paints a picture that is vivid but incomplete. You lean against a pillar, watching servants crush ice into bowls and mix it with rosewater syrup. The liquid shivers in the lamplight, and when you take a sip, your lips tingle from the contrast, the desert heat pressing in on your skin while the drink shocks your tongue with coolness. You laugh softly, surprised at how indulgent it feels, and realize this was ancient Persia's equivalent of showing off the newest gadget. And yes, your modern brain can't resist a comparison. So basically, nobles were flexing their version of a stainless steel fridge with an ice dispenser, except their appliance was a giant mud brick dome outside. You smirk at the thought of a Persian aristocrat bragging to his neighbor. "Oh, your sherbet is lukewarm? How unfortunate." Around you, the atmosphere swells with opulence. Musicians pluck at lutes, dancers sway gracefully, and nobles raise chilled cups in toasts. Every sip of cold drink reinforces their sense of refinement, as though they bent the climate itself to their pleasure. For the wealthy, the Yakhchal wasn't only about preservation. It was about performance, about turning the desert into a stage for comfort and sophistication. As you step back into garden shade, the laughter and music blur into the background. You glance at the shimmering pool, at the goblets glittering with ice, and you realize the Yakhchal, silent and unassuming outside the palace walls, has just elevated survival into luxury. It has transformed necessity into delight, proving that even in the harshest climate, humanity always finds a way to turn survival into spectacle. You drift away from the palace garden and wander into the humbler lanes of the village, where the noble's luxury trickles down into everyday rhythms. Here, the Yakhchal serves not as spectacle but as quiet necessity, woven into the fabric of daily chores. The smell of bread baking greets you before you see it, and when you turn a corner, you find a baker kneading dough at a low wooden table. His sleeves are rolled up, his arms dusted with flour, and beside him sits a clay jug of cold water drawn that morning from a Yakhchal. Mainstream history tells us that even the simplest tasks, mixing dough, preserving milk, or cooling fruit, were transformed by the availability of stored ice and cold water. Bakers used chilled water to slow fermentation in the heat, ensuring their bread didn't sour before it was baked. Families dipped vegetables in cool basins to keep them crisp until dinner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival sharpened into habit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households believe that cold water gave bread a densicrum, making it more filling. Mothers joked that a slice of bread made with a night's chill could keep a child full twice as long. Was it science or superstition? Hard to say, but you can imagine a kid groaning, "Not the heavy bread again," while still chewing happily. Historians still argue how widespread access to Yakhchal resources really was. Did every family draw from it daily, or was it rationed, with poorer households getting only occasional benefits? Some scholars claim communal use was common, while others insist it was controlled by elites who allowed limited sharing. The evidence is patchy, leaving room for speculation and, inevitably, debate. You crouch beside the baker, watching as he dips his hand into the jug and sprinkles cool water over the dough. Steam from the oven rises behind him, hot and relentless. Yet here he stands, balancing fire and ice in the same breath. He smiles at you, tearing off a chunk of bread fresh on the hearth, the crust crackling as it breaks. You taste it, warm on the outside, but with a subtle density that suggests the dough was tempered by cold water. It's simple, hearty, and perfect. Your modern brain, of course, sneaks in with grin. So, basically, Persians were meal prepping with temperature hacks long, before TikTok recipes. You picture someone making a tutorial. Step 1, haul ice from the mountains. Step 2, don't die of heat stroke. Not exactly bite-sized content, but effective. As the day unfolds, you see more scenes like this. A woman rinses cucumbers in a shallow bowl of chilled water, setting them on a tray for her family. Children run back from the Yakhchal carrying jars, splashing each other with icy droplets before their mothers scold them. A shepherd drops off a skin of milk, grateful it can be cool before turning sour. Each moment is small, ordinary even, but together they reveal the Yakhchal's true triumph. Not just in palaces, but in the dusty kitchens and courtyards where life was lived. You step back into the street, bread still warm in your hand, and glance toward the distant dome. It rises steady and quiet, a humble giant that doesn't boast of luxury or wealth, but of consistency. For ordinary Persians, that reliability was everything. It turned harsh summers into survivable seasons, giving them the gift of normalcy in a land that refused to be gentle. You leave behind the bustle of kitchens and markets, wandering again to the silent presence of the dome itself. By now, you've grown familiar with its outline against the horizon, but you pause to look more closely at its body. Not at the grandeur, but at the secrets tucked into its very walls. You brush your hand across the surface and notice how it doesn't crumble like ordinary clay. Instead, it feels layered, almost like the rings of a tree pressed flat. The Persians, you realize, built with intention, crafting defenses against the desert one layer at a time. Mainstream history points out that the walls of a Yakhchal weren't made in one go. Builders applied sarouj in stages, each layer compacted and dried before the next was added. Some walls reached 2 meters thick, with alternating textures that resisted cracking. The layered construction trapped air between pockets, slowing the movement of heat. The result? A natural insulator strong enough to keep ice intact through months of blistering sun. Here's a quirky tidbit. Local legends claim that some masons mix camel milk into the mortar for extra strength. Modern science laughs at this, but the story persists in villages where old men swear their grandfathers swore it was true. You grin at the thought of a builder tugging on a camel's teat and saying, "This is for the walls, not for breakfast." Historians still argue about how effective these layers truly were. Did the insulation keep the interior close to freezing all year, or did villagers still have to replenish ice frequently? Some archaeological digs suggest extraordinary efficiency, while others hint at significant melting. The truth remains blurred, leaving experts to spar politely over mud, mortar, and thermodynamics. You run your fingertips across a crack that snakes along the wall. It feels like an old scar, one that survived centuries of sandstorms and scorching summers. Yet beneath your hand, the wall is solid, reassuring. You imagine the builders, their hands coated in lime and ash, tamping each layer with wooden mallets, humming work songs as they worked under the unforgiving sun. Every strike was an act of defiance. "You will not take our ice, desert." And of course, your modern humor bubbles up. You chuckle softly. So, basically, this is ancient insulation, minus the itchy fiberglass that gets stuck to your arms when you try to fix the attic. The Persians had their own version of Home Depot, except theirs was staffed with camels and buckets of goat hair. You step back and tilt your head, studying the dome as twilight deepens. The layered walls don't look delicate. They look alive, as though each band of mortar remembers the hands that shaped it. Shadows stretch across its surface, emphasizing the ridges and textures that time couldn't erase. The building doesn't just stand in the desert. It endures, shrugging off centuries the way you shrug off a hot breeze. As the stars emerge, you realize the brilliance of these walls wasn't only in their thickness or materials. It was in their philosophy. Build with patience, accept that endurance comes from layers, not haste. And in that lesson, the Persians left behind more than structure. They left wisdom, baked into clay, whispering that survival is best achieved not by shortcuts, but by persistence. You step back from the dome, your hands still dusted with traces of mortar, and your ears catch the faint murmur of conversation nearby. A group of men sit in the glow of a lantern, their scrolls and wax tablets scattered across a low table. They're not builders nor merchants, but scholars, men who lean into the mysteries of their world with ink-stained fingers and endless questions. And tonight, their topic is the Yakhchal. Mainstream history reminds us that while everyone in Persia benefited from ice storage, thinkers and scribes couldn't resist asking, how does it actually work? Was it the thickness of the walls, the underground chambers, the way wind and water interacted? Some recorded meticulous notes about construction techniques, while others spun fanciful theories involving divine blessings or astrological alignments. For the intellectuals, every beehive-shaped dome was both a marvel and a puzzle. Here's a quirky tidbit. One medieval text describes a scholar who insisted the Yakhchal's cooling power came from the size of the earth itself. He claimed the dome was like a giant lung, exhaling chill at night and inhaling heat by day. Poetic, yes, but also hilariously unscientific. You imagine his colleagues rolling their eyes, muttering, "Here we go again with the sighing earth theory." Historians still argue over just how effective these ancient structures were in measurable terms. Could they really maintain ice throughout the year, or were the glowing accounts exaggerated by poets and travelers? Some modern researchers have modeled Yakhchals and found them surprisingly efficient. Others caution that maintenance, repairs, and climate variations must have made a difference. The debate continues, echoing across conferences where academics argue with more heat than the structures they're discussing. You linger by the scholars' circle, listening as their voices rise and fall. One insists the walls are the secret, another swears it's the airflow, and a third waves his hands dramatically, proclaiming that without nightly desert chills, the whole system would collapse. Their arguments blur into a kind of music, the rhythm of curiosity itself. And of course, your modern brain supplies a smirk. So, basically, this is the ancient version of YouTube comments. Everyone convinced they're right, everyone half wrong, and nobody changing their mind. You chuckle under your breath, almost expecting one of the scholars to shout, "First," just to claim victory. But beneath the humor, you feel the weight of their fascination. The Yakhchal wasn't just mud and straw to them. It was proof that humans could bend nature without breaking it. Whether they called it science, philosophy, or poetry, they were grasping toward the same truth. Ingenuity lives where necessity burns hottest. The lantern flickers, and you see the scholar's shadows stretch across the wall of the dome. Their silhouettes merge with the ancient structure, as if debate itself has become part of its foundation. You close your eyes, breathing in the scent of ink, clay, and desert night, and you realize that even the arguments, the endless, unresolved bickering, are a kind of preservation, not of ice this time, but of curiosity, kept cool across centuries by the same dome that held frozen water. You leave the circle of scholars behind, their voices fading into the night, and your thoughts wander further afield. You picture yourself lifting away from Persia's desert plains, drifting over seas and mountains, tracing echoes of the same human problem. How you keep things cool when the sun wants everything warm. You land in Egypt first, where jars buried in sand serve to keep water fresh. Shaded courtyards helping food last a little longer. Families that relied on the Nile's rhythms as much as the desert's chill nights. Mainstream history tells us that Greeks, too, had their version of refrigeration. Wealthy Athenians sent servants in the mountains to gather snow, storing it in pits lined with straw. They mixed it with honeyed drinks, creating concoctions that were as much display as refreshment. Romans later followed suit, building snow pits and even using their famed aqueducts to channel cooler water into city fountains. Across the ancient world, people stumbled toward the same goal, fighting heat with cleverness. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Greek banquet reportedly featured wine cooled with snow that slaves carried down from Mount Olympus. Guests boasted afterward that they'd tasted the mountain's breath. You can almost imagine the servants rolling their eyes, exhausted from hauling snow, muttering that they'd rather taste bread than mountain breath. Historians still argue whether Persia's Yakhchals influenced these other systems or whether the ideas emerged independently. Did merchants and travelers carry knowledge of cooling techniques along the trade routes, or were similar solutions simply inevitable in hot climates? The evidence is scattered, leading to familiar debates: invention versus diffusion, originality versus adaptation. The truth, like a block of ice, is slippery and hard to hold. You imagine yourself traveling the Silk Road, caravans trudging past you with bales of silk, sacks of spices, and whispers of innovations. Perhaps a Persian trader boasted about his village's Yakhchal, inspiring a merchant from India to dig deeper ice pits back home. Or maybe the ideas sprouted like weeds, springing up independently wherever people stared down summer and refused to blink first. Your modern brain, of course, can't resist chiming in. You smirk. So, basically, everyone in the ancient world was dealing with the same problem: warm drinks. And just like us, they were willing to invent entire architectural systems just to avoid drinking lukewarm water. Some things never change. Nobody likes a tepid beverage. As you drift back toward Persia, the comparisons cling like sand to your sandals. You realize that though methods differed, snow pits in Greece, shaded courtyards in Egypt, aqueduct-cooled fountains in Rome, the Persian Yakhchal stood apart. It wasn't just a trick or a temporary fix. It was a monument, a deliberate marriage of architecture and environment, scaling up humble tricks into something grand. You glance once more at the dome rising in the starlit desert. Against the backdrop of history, it stands out not because it was the only solution, but because it was the boldest. Where others dug pits or carried snow, Persians raised mountains of their own, domes of mud and mortar, solid as time itself. You stand once more beneath the looming dome, and your thoughts begin to stretch outward along the same paths that caravans once carved into the desert. Beyond Persia, the Silk Road unfurls like a ribbon, carrying not only spices and silks, but also ideas. Quiet passengers that traveled as surely as camels and wagons. The Yakhchal was one of those ideas, and you imagine how its whispers echoed in distant lands. Mainstream history notes that along the Silk Road, Persia was both gatekeeper and bridge. Traders from China, India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean passed through its cities, resting in caravanserais where cool water and preserved food could make or break a journey. The ability to offer a traveler chilled fruit or water wasn't just kindness. It was reputation, proof that Persia was not merely a land of passage, but a place of refinement. Merchants who stopped here often carried stories home about these marvels. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe caravans carrying small lumps of ice eastward, not for trade but as gifts. Imagine a Chinese merchant receiving a piece of Persian ice wrapped in straw, marveling at how it survived the trip. He probably stared at it like a modern person stares at a souvenir snow globe, half fascinated, half bewildered, wondering if it was magic. Historians still argue how much influence Persia's cooling technology actually had on distant regions. Did India's stepwells and China's ice pits evolve independently, or were they nudged forward by stories of the Yakhchal? The evidence is frustratingly thin, and debates continue in academic journals, where scholars spar politely with footnotes instead of swords. You picture yourself standing in a caravanserai courtyard, travelers unpacking bundles while camels grunt in relief. Someone ladles chilled water into your hands, and you drink gratefully, the shock of coolness cutting through fatigue. Around you, voices speak in a dozen languages: Turkic, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, each trader carrying not just goods but observations. One remarks on the astonishing cold storage of Persia. Another shakes his head skeptically. And yet, by the time they reach their homelands, the story of the beehive domes has already taken on the shimmer of myth. And of course, your modern brain cracks a grin. You mutter softly. So, basically, ancient Persia had the original 5-star Yelp review. Great stop on the Silk Road. Water was cold, melons were fresh, would caravan again. If there had been hashtags, hashtag coolest stop would have trended for centuries. You walk back into the night, picturing those long strings of travelers, their lanterns bobbing across the desert like fireflies. Every dome that loomed over the horizon was more than a landmark. It was an advertisement of stability, a promise that Persia could make the desert self-hospitable. Through trade, that promise rippled outward, becoming part of the Silk Road's legacy. Not just movement of goods, but sharing of human solutions. The Yakhchal, you realize, wasn't only a Persian treasure. It was a gift the desert gave the world, carried on camelback, whispered in markets, and eventually embedded in the memory of civilizations far from these sands. You walk slowly along a quieter street, away from merchants and caravans, until the sound of the market fades into silence. Here, near a shaded courtyard, you hear not the jangle of trade, but the softer murmur of voices reciting poetry. A group of men sit cross-legged with scrolls spread open, their words floating like incense into the warm night. And unexpectedly, you realize they are speaking not of war or kings, but of ice, of coldness, of preservation turned metaphor. Mainstream history reminds us that Persian culture was rich in poetry and metaphor, where even simple objects could become symbols of love, longing, and purity. Cooling, with its rare and precious nature, often appeared in verses. A lover's touch was compared to the shock of ice in midsummer. A heart's devotion was likened to water preserved clear and cool in a jar. What began as survival became inspiration, weaving its way into the cultural soul. Here's a quirky tidbit. One medieval poet joked that his beloved's indifference was colder than sherbet left too long in the Yakhchal. It was part insult, part compliment, depending on how you read it. You chuckle at the thought, ancient pickup lines powered by refrigeration technology. Imagine whispering, "You're as refreshing as snow in Shiraz," and actually meaning it. Historians still argue whether these poetic references reflect real experiences with chilled delicacies among common folk, or whether they were exaggerated symbols borrowed from elite households. Did ordinary Persians ever taste the sorbets that poets praised, or was it a literary device divorced from daily life? The ambiguity keeps scholars busy, parsing verses like detectives searching for crumbs of ice and parchment. You sit cross-legged beside the group, listening as the words cascade in rhythm. One recites lines comparing cold water to the calmness of faith. Another describes lovers walking together, eating chilled grapes as stars blossomed above them. The imagery is intoxicating, a reminder that technology wasn't just about engineering. It was about shaping imagination, and your modern brain can't resist adding its twist. You murmur with a smile. So, basically, ancient poets turned ice into the Beyoncé of metaphors, rare, dazzling, and guaranteed to impress an audience. If Twitter had existed then, half of Persia would have been retweeting verses about cold water and longing hearts. As the poetry continues, you notice how faces soften, how listeners lean closer. For them, these metaphors were vivid, grounded in real sensation. They had tasted cold sherbet on a hot day, felt chilled water trickle down their throats. And so the poems resonated. What began as a dome of mud and straw had rippled outward into language, shaping how people thought about love, purity, and even sorrow. You lean back against the wall, closing your eyes as the rhythm of recitation blends with the cool night air. The words wrap around you like a blanket, gentle and steady. And you realize the Yakhchal preserved more than ice. It preserved metaphor, turning something as fleeting as coldness into poetry that still drifts across centuries, whispering of love and longing. You drift away from the circle of poets, their verses still echoing in your ears, and wander down a stretch of road that feels strangely abandoned. The sand drifts higher against walls, weeds push through cracks, and the silence is so complete you hear only your own footsteps. At first, you wonder if you've taken a wrong turn, but then you see it. Another dome, once proud, now crumbling, its surface is scarred with fissures, the mortar flaking like dried skin. This Yakhchal hasn't been touched in years. Mainstream history reminds us that no invention, no matter how brilliant, is immune to time. As empires fell and rulers shifted, some Yakhchals were neglected. Without maintenance, their walls cracked under desert winds and storms, their storage pits filled with dust. Villages that once depended on them emptied out, their inhabitants drawn to new cities or fresh water sources. The domes remained, but their purpose faded, like lanterns with no flame. Here's a quirky tidbit. Travelers in later centuries sometimes mistook these abandoned domes for tombs. From afar, they resembled mausoleums, silent and brooding in the desert. One even earned a nickname, the Giant's Grave, among locals who had forgotten its true function. Imagine stumbling across a structure meant to hold ice and assuming it housed a sleeping giant instead. History's version of a mislabeled Tupperware container. Historians still argue why certain Yakhchals were left a ruin while others continue to thrive. Was it purely geography, shifts in trade routes and water supplies, or did changing tastes and technologies make them obsolete? Some suggest new methods of storage arose, while others believe war and migration simply left them behind. The reasons blur like heat haze, never entirely clear. You step closer to the ruined dome, brushing your hand against the cracked mortar. It crumbles under your touch, leaving powdery residue on your fingers. Inside, the once deep storage chamber is filled with sand, the echo of footsteps replaced by silence. You try to imagine it alive again, ice stacked neatly, voices bustling, children laughing. The contrast feels almost melancholy, like walking through an abandoned theater where applause once thundered. And of course, your modern humor can't resist surfacing. You murmur. So, basically, this is the ancient version of a dead mall, once thriving, now just pigeons and echoes. You smirk, even as a pang of sadness lingers. You walk slowly around the ruin, the desert wind tugging at your clothes, the cracks spidering across its surface like wrinkles on a once youthful face. It feels strangely human, majestic in its time, now fragile, vulnerable. And yet, even in ruin, the Yakhchal holds dignity. Its bones remain, whispering of the lives it once sustained, the communities it once cooled. As twilight deepens, you pause, gazing at the dome silhouetted against the fading sky. You realize the lesson isn't just about preservation of ice, but about impermanence itself. Even the greatest offenses against heat couldn't defend against the erosion of time. And in that silence, The abandoned Yakhchal becomes more than a building. It becomes a reminder that all human brilliance eventually returns to dust. You leave behind the cracked dome, the silence of its ruin clinging to you, and wander toward another site where the scene feels altogether different. Here, instead of decay, you find men and women with notebooks, measuring rods, and curious eyes. They kneel in the sand, sketching outlines, tracing shadows, and running their fingers across ancient mortar. These are not villagers or merchants. They are modern engineers and archaeologists rediscovering what had once been nearly forgotten. Mainstream history tells us that in recent centuries, many Yakhchals were abandoned, but their designs never fully disappeared. By the late 20th and early 21st century, architects began studying them again, amazed at how these ancient structures accomplish what modern cooling systems do, but without burning a single drop of fuel. Universities in Iran and abroad have published studies modeling their airflow, wall thickness, and energy efficiency, uncovering wisdom that feels oddly futuristic. Here's a quirky tidbit. One group of engineers in the 1970s reportedly brought thermometers into a surviving Yakhchal and were baffled when a reading stayed near freezing while outside temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius. One man supposedly muttered, "This thing is a giant clay refrigerator, and we thought we invented sustainability." You can imagine the embarrassed chuckle that followed. Historians still argue whether we should call this a rediscovery, or simply a continuation of knowledge that was never truly lost. Rural communities had kept fragments of the tradition alive, even as cities shifted to electric refrigeration. But now, with climate change pressing heavily on our minds, scholars debate whether these passive systems should inspire new architecture in modern cities. Is it revival or reinvention? The line is blurry. You step closer, crouching beside one of the engineers. He brushes away sand to reveal the entrance of a long-buried chamber, the cool draft surprising even in the midday heat. He grins at you, holding up his notes, eager to prove that these domes were not just quaint relics, but blueprints for the future. Around him, students sketch diagrams that look suspiciously like the technical draw. And yes, your modern brain can't resist chiming in. You whisper to yourself, "So, basically, we're raiding humanity's junk drawer, dusting off a 2,000-year-old gadget, and realizing it works better than the new stuff." You laugh softly, imagining ancient Persians smugly crossing their arms and saying, "Told you so." As the sun lowers, casting long shadows, you glance back at the engineers. Their measuring tapes glint like threads of light, their notebooks flutter in the breeze, and their voices rise in excitement. In their hands, the forgotten wisdom of Persia is not just preserved, it's reborn. The Yakhchal, once neglected, is being reintroduced to the world not as a relic of the past, but as a model for the future. And you realize the dome doesn't just hold ice, it holds lessons. Lessons about patience, observation, and the art of bending nature without breaking it. Lessons we still desperately need, written in mud brick and goat hair, waiting patiently for us to pay attention again. You linger near the group of engineers, their notebooks rustling like leaves in the desert wind, and your thoughts stretch further, beyond archaeology, into the present day. You imagine standing in a modern city, where concrete towers hum with the constant buzz of air conditioners. Every window drips condensation. Every vent exhales heat into streets already shimmering under the sun. The comparison hits you. The Persians solved this problem 2,000 years ago, without needing to plug anything in. Mainstream history now highlights the sustainability of the Yakhchal. By using natural insulation, evaporative cooling, and airflow from wind catchers, these domes preserved ice and food without burning wood or coal. In today's world, where climate change makes summers hotter and electricity grids groan under demand, this ancient design feels startlingly relevant. Architects and environmentalists increasingly look back to passive cooling techniques as models for the future. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 2016, Iranian architects unveiled a project called the Ice House Competition, inviting designers to create modern versions of the Yakhchal. Some submissions looked like futuristic domes of glass and steel. Others stayed faithful to mud and brick. One design even proposed using recycled plastic bottles filled with water as insulating walls. Imagine ancient Persians raising an eyebrow at that. You build a refrigerator out of bottles? We used goat hair and it lasted 2,000 years. Historians and engineers still argue whether reviving these structures on a large scale is practical. Could a Yakhchal-sized dome cool an entire neighborhood today? Or is it best suited for rural communities? Some say yes, pointing to experiments in desert regions that have proven successful. Others argue that modern lifestyles require different solutions. The debate continues, but the fascination grows. You crouch near the base of a dome, imagining what it would be like if your own city adopted this ancient logic. Instead of the endless hum of compressors, you'd hear wind sliding through tall towers, cooled by evaporating water. Instead of energy bills climbing higher each summer, you'd rely on mud, lime, and patience. It's both humbling and oddly hopeful that the past might hand us a lifeline for the future. And of course, your modern brain can't help but grin. You mutter under your breath. So basically, the Persians invented the off-grid fridge, and we're only now realizing it's the ultimate green tech. You picture some ancient builder smirking smugly at an energy summit, sipping cold rose water while the rest of us scramble for solutions. As the desert wind shifts, you glance at the dome glowing in moonlight. It looks timeless, neither ancient nor modern, just wise. And you realize the Yakhchal doesn't belong only to history. It belongs to tomorrow, too, quietly reminding us that sometimes the smartest technology is the one that listens to the land instead of fighting it. You step away from the engineers and wander toward a nearby village school, where the voices of children spill into the warm air like birdsong. Inside a small courtyard, you see a teacher standing beneath the shade of a fig tree, holding a simple clay model of a Yakhchal. Around her, children sit cross-legged, their eyes wide as she gestures to the beehive dome in her hands. You pause at the threshold, realizing you're watching not just a lesson in history, but in pride. Mainstream history often gets taught as kings, wars, and empires, but here the focus is different. The teacher explains how their ancestors built domes strong enough to keep ice through scorching summers, long before anyone else imagined such a thing. She speaks of ingenuity, of resilience, of listening to the desert rather than fighting it. The children lean in, their voices rising in awe when she describes the goat hair and ash mixed into mortar, the tunnels of canets bringing cool water from mountains. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some schools in Iran actually organize field trips where students walk into surviving Yakhchals. They run their fingers across ancient walls, whisper to each other about how cold the air feels, and laugh nervously as echoes bounce back from the dome. One child reportedly asked, "Can we live in here during exams?" A request that probably made more sense than it sounded. Historians still argue how much cultural continuity exists between the builders of Yakhchals and today's Iranians. Are modern communities the direct inheritors of that knowledge, or has it been pieced back together through archaeology and storytelling? The answers shift depending on who you ask, but either way, the sense of pride remains. For many, the Yakhchal isn't just a relic. It's a symbol of what it means to be Iranian. You watch the children as they take turns passing the clay model, their small fingers tracing its curves. Their teacher smiles, telling them that these domes are reminders that their ancestors didn't just survive the desert. They mastered it. The children repeat the word Yakhchal in unison, their voices ringing like a chant. You feel a warmth in your chest, realizing that a piece of ancient ingenuity is being carried forward generation by generation. And of course, your modern humor sneaks in. You grin at the thought. So basically, these kids are getting a field trip to the world's coolest fridge, while your school trip was probably just a local zoo. It's both humbling and a little funny that their lessons involve walking into a 2,000-year-old dome still doing its job. As the class disperses, the children skip away, shouting jokes and balancing imaginary ice blocks on their heads. You linger a moment longer, watching the teacher carefully set the clay model back on the shelf. The pride in her eyes says everything. This is more than history. It's identity, woven into the fabric of a people who refuse to let their past vanish. You step back into the evening, the laughter still echoing in your ears, and you realize the Yakhchal isn't just an architectural marvel. It's a story still being told. By parents, by teachers, by children who inherit not just the knowledge, but the wonder. You leave the schoolyard behind, the echo of children's laughter fading into the night, and your path takes you toward the soft glow of lanterns at a caravanserai. Here, travelers gather after long journeys, resting their feet and swapping stories. The courtyard buzzes with the rustle of fabrics, the clink of coins, and the scent of roasted lamb. And tucked into the corner, near a shaded alcove, you spot a small crowd forming around something strangely familiar. Cups of chilled sherbet, served from bowls filled with ice drawn from a Yakhchāl. Mainstream history tells us that Persia's caravanserais were more than inns. They were hubs of exchange, where goods, languages, and ideas all flowed together. Offering cold drinks to weary travelers wasn't just hospitality. It was advertisement. It showed Persia's ingenuity and left an impression strong enough to be carried home in stories. Merchants who tasted chilled rosewater here would remember it long after they returned to Damascus, Samarkand, or Delhi. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe sherbet served with noodles, thin strands of starch floating in rosewater syrup. It sounds unusual, but imagine the surprise of tasting something icy, textured, and sweet after days on the road. Travelers wrote of it with wide-eyed wonder, some insisting it was food of paradise. You can almost hear a caravan guard muttering, "Best part of the trip, worth the blisters." Historians still argue whether these chilled treats were everyday fare for travelers or rare indulgences offered only in wealthy inns. Was the sherbet a common sight, or did most merchants simply drink cool water? Evidence is scattered between poems, travelogues, and fragmentary accounts, leaving scholars to piece together the puzzle. You sit on a low bench, accepting a clay cup from the innkeeper. The sherbet tastes delicate, sweetened with honey and perfumed with rose. The coldness makes you close your eyes for a moment. It's shocking, delightful, almost decadent after the heat of the day. Around you, other travelers sigh with relief, their voices rising in laughter and half-serious toasts. For them, this is more than refreshment. It's memory in the making. And of course, your modern brain supplies its twist. You grin softly. So, basically, this is the world's first roadside slushy stand. Except instead of pulling over at a gas station, you rode for weeks across the desert. You picture a merchant raising his clay cup and declaring, "Best rest stop ever," while his camel chews indifferently in the corner. As the night deepens, the caravanserai settles into calm. Lanterns sway, casting long shadows, while the Yakhchal looms silently outside the walls. Its invisible contribution fills every cup, every laugh, every sigh of contentment. And you realize, for the travelers who crossed harsh landscapes, the memory of chilled sherbet in Persia was as valuable as the spices or silks they carried. It was proof that even in the desert, humanity could coax joy from the heat. You step out from a caravanserai courtyard, your lips still tingling from rosewater sherbet, and the desert greets you again with its silence. This time, you notice a different mood hanging in the air. Not the liveliness of markets or the laughter of poets, but the solemn hush of fragility. A dome stands before you, proud but weary. Its walls are marked with deep cracks, wide enough for weeds to sprout. The mortar has begun to flake, and birds nest where once air channels breathe coolness. The Yakhchal looks like an old warrior, scarred but still standing. Mainstream history acknowledges that many of these structures are now endangered. Centuries of neglect, shifting sands, and modern development have left some domes in peril. The very materials that made them so effective, mud, straw, and sarouge, require maintenance, constant care against weather and time. Without attention, even the most ingenious invention erodes. Communities that once depended on them now walk past, relying instead on electric refrigerators, leaving the old domes to crumble in silence. Here's a quirky tidbit. In a few villages, people still whisper superstitions about abandoned Yakhchals. Some believe jinn dwell inside the cracked chambers, their laughter echoing at night. Others say that if you press your ear to the wall at midnight, you'll hear the sighs of the stored ice, long melted but still remembered by the stones. Creepy bedtime stories mixed with architecture, who says practicality and mystery can't coexist. Historians still argue about how best to preserve these fragile remains. Should they be restored with modern materials to ensure survival, or rebuilt faithfully with the same ancient recipes of clay, ash, and goat hair? Some claim modernization betrays authenticity, while others argue that without intervention, the domes won't last another century. The debate, much like the desert wind, circles endlessly, You press your palm against one fissure. It feels brittle, as if it might crumble further with your touch. And yet beneath the cracks, there's still strength, layers upon layers that defied the desert for centuries. You picture the builders who once stood here, proud of their craft, never imagining their work would outlive empires. You wonder what they'd think now, seeing their legacy erode not from heat, but from neglect. And of course, your modern humor surfaces, a little bittersweet this time. You murmur. So basically, this is the ancient version of forgetting to defrost your freezer, except instead of a little mess, you lose an entire monument. The joke makes you smile faintly, but the weight of the image lingers. As dusk falls, the cracked dome casts long, jagged shadows across the sand like ribs of a sleeping beast. You step back, letting the image settle in your mind. The Yakhchal may be fragile now, but even in decline it commands respect. It stands as a reminder of ingenuity, of survival, of beauty shaped from mud. And you know, even if it collapses tomorrow, its story has already survived far longer than its builders ever dreamed. You walk on, leaving behind the weary dome with its cracks and shadows, and soon the air grows lively again. You hear laughter, the clatter of pans, and the faint hum of conversation rising from a courtyard where lanterns sway. Inside, families gather around long mats, trays of food spread before them. But what catches your attention isn't the bread or the stew. It's the sound of spoons scraping against bowls filled with something cold, something unexpected. Tonight, the Yakhchal has become the quiet star of a feast. Mainstream history tells us that Persians developed an early version of faloodeh, a chilled dessert made from thin rice noodles mixed with syrup and served with ice or snow. Rose water and lime juice gave it perfume and tartness, turning the shock of cold into a delicate balance of flavors. To taste it after hours under the sun must have felt like biting into a dream. This wasn't just food. It was theater, the kind that made every guest sit up straighter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval travelers sometimes describe Persians eating snow with syrup as if it were medicine. One account even claimed it cured heat headaches and foul moods. Imagine being grumpy and someone handing you a bowl of shaved ice with honey. Honestly, it might work better than aspirin. Historians still argue whether desserts like faloodeh were widely available or reserved only for the elite. Did villagers enjoy them occasionally, or were they luxury for nobles and wealthy merchants? Some sources suggest sherbets and chilled desserts filtered down into everyday life. Others maintain they remain status symbols. The truth likely lies in between, where shared access to ice made occasional indulgence possible even for modest households. You crouch at the edge of the mat as a boy proudly serves you a bowl. Thin white noodles float in syrup, strands glistening like threads of moonlight. The first bite shocks your tongue, icy, fragrant, sweet with honey, sharp with lime. You laugh softly, surprised at how modern it feels, as though you've stumbled into a 2,000-year-old dessert cafe. And of course, your modern humor kicks in. You grin. So basically, Persian invented sorbet, and here I thought gelato was fancy. You picture some ancient noble bragging. Oh, you've never tried noodles with ice? It's a trend in Shiraz this season. Influencers would have had a field day. Around you, families eat slowly, savoring every spoonful. The children's laughter rises, their cheeks flush from cold bites and hot air. Elders lean back, sighing contentedly, perhaps remembering when they first tasted the same dish decades ago. In the glow of lanterns, the bowls sparkle like tiny miracles. Proof that survival didn't just mean enduring heat. It meant transforming it into joy. You set your bowl aside, your lips tingling from lime, your throat cooled in a way that feels almost luxurious. Looking toward the distant dome silhouetted against the stars, you realize the Yakhchal wasn't just for storage. It was for nights like this, when the desert gave up its harshness and people with ingenuity and ice carved delight out of difficulty. You leave the courtyard feast behind, your mouth still tingling from rose water and lime, and wander into the quiet stretch of desert beyond the village. The stars burn brighter here, scattered like frozen sparks across the sky, and the air carries the first edge of night's chill. You pause, pulling your cloak tighter, and you think about how fragile comfort feels in a place like this. How do you hold on to cold in a land determined to burn it away? Mainstream history reminds us that the Persians weren't alone in facing climate extremes. Every civilization has wrestled with heat and drought, but here the stakes were sharper. Summer temperatures could climb above 40 degrees Celsius, yet nights plunged toward freezing. This swing gave the Yakhchal its strange advantage. The desert's own rhythm could be harnessed, if you were clever enough to catch it, and Persia was. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some chronicles describe villagers spreading shallow pools of water at night, relying on the sharp temperature drop to freeze thin layers by dawn. They scraped up the ice, block by block, and carried it to the Yakhchal. Children apparently turned this into a game, racing each other to collect the biggest slab before sunrise. Imagine explaining to a sleepy kid, "Yes, you have chores. Go harvest the ice." Historians still argue whether this nightly freezing method was widely practiced, or whether it was a rare supplement to mountain ice. Was it reliable enough to sustain large communities, or just a clever side trick for especially cold nights? The evidence is uncertain, but the persistence of these stories suggests the practice was at least known, if not universal. You walk across the sand, imagine the ancient rhythm. By day, the desert burned. By night, villagers spread water, watched the stars, and prayed for frost. Each frozen sheet was a gift, delicate as glass, fragile as hope. You picture yourself crouching at dawn, lifting a shimmering slab in your hands, your breath fogging in the sudden cold, your fingers aching yet proud. And of course, your modern humor nudges you. You smirk and mutter. So basically, Persian kids were doing the world's first ice bucket challenge, except theirs was mandatory and nobody was posted online. You grin, half amused, half impressed. As you pause beneath the starlight, you realize the bigger truth. The Persians' fight against heat wasn't just about survival. It was about balance. They learned to use the desert's cruelty, the punishing heat by day, the sudden cold by night, to their advantage. They bent nature without breaking it, listening carefully, adapting endlessly. And in doing so, they created not only refrigeration, but a philosophy of coexistence. You exhale, your breath a ghostly plume in the cooling air. Around you, the desert stretches silent, its vastness both threatening and protective. And you understand, the Yakhchal was never only a machine for storing ice. It was a pact of the climate, a reminder that even in a land of extremes, wisdom could carve out comfort. You turn back toward the village, but instead of heading for the familiar dome, you drift toward a quieter cluster of homes at the edge of the settlement. Here, families live in modest mud brick houses, their walls painted with lime to ward off the heat. Smoke curls lazily from cooking fires, and the smell of lentil stew drifts through the narrow alleys. What strikes you most, though, isn't the food. It's how often you see the influence of the Yakhchal in daily domestic life. Mainstream history shows that refrigeration wasn't reserved only for palaces or caravanserais. Ordinary families adapted its principles for their own needs, copying the logic of insulation and evaporation on a smaller scale. Clay jars lined with damp cloths, underground storage niches beneath courtyards, and even miniature personal Yakhchals built into the walls kept food edible longer than the sun would normally allow. Each home became a micro version of the Great Domes, proof that innovation trickled down to the smallest kitchens. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families store butter or cheese wrapped in leaves, tucked into clay pots, cool with water from the cannon. Children joke that the pots had to nap in the shade so the cheese wouldn't melt. You can picture a kid sneaking a taste, only to get scolded for waking the cheese before dinner. Historians still argue how widespread this household refrigeration really was. Did every family manage it, or was it a privilege of villages near functioning cannons and Yakhchals? Archaeological traces suggest a mix. Some homes show evidence of clever cooling pits, others none at all. The debate lingers. Was cooling a universal convenience or a patchwork luxury, depending on geography and resources? You crouch in one of these homes, peering into a small clay alcove where jars of milk sit in the cool shadow. The air smells faintly sour, but not spoiled, proof that the method works. A woman lifts the lid on one jar, scoops out thickened yogurt, and hands you a small wooden spoon. The taste is tangy, fresh, startlingly cool for such a warm day. You close your eyes, savoring it, marveling that ingenuity can be this simple. And of course, your modern humor can't resist. You murmur. So basically, this is the ancient version of a mini fridge, minus the stickers, the buzzing noise, and the half-eaten takeout containers. You picture a Persian teenager arguing with his mother about whether the clay jar was his personal snack stash. Some arguments, apparently, are timeless. As the evening deepens, you watch neighbors trade jars, share cool fruits, and laugh together. The Yakhchal looms in the distance, but here in these homes you see its legacy written in everyday gestures. Spoonfuls of yogurt, slices of melon, pitchers of chilled water. The technology wasn't just grand architecture. It was a rhythm that seeped into kitchens, meals, and conversations. You step back into the alley, the air cooling with the night. Around you, children run past with cups of water. Women stir pots with calm efficiency. And men return from the fields carrying baskets of cucumbers kept crisp in clay. The whole village hums with the quiet confidence of people who know their food will last another day. And you realize the Yakhchal's greatest success wasn't towering domes. It was the way logic found a home in every household, quietly shaping daily life. You wander past a cluster of homes and follow a winding path that climbs a gentle slope toward the hills. The air thins slightly, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint tang of dust blown from higher ground. And then you see them, stone-lined tunnels vanishing into the earth, their mouths dark and mysterious. You crouch near one, peering into the shadow, and a cool breath of air drifts out. This is a Khanate system, the hidden lifeline that made the Yakhchal possible in the first place. Mainstream history praises Khanates as one of Persia's greatest achievements. Ingenious underground channels, dug by hand, carried water from mountain aquifers across miles of desert to villages, fields, and storage domes. By keeping water below ground, out of the punishing sun, the Persians avoided evaporation and harnessed gravity itself to deliver life. Without Khanates, the Yakhchal would have been a thirsty dome with no way to sustain its cold heart. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Khanates were so extensive that workers dug vertical shafts every few hundred meters to let air circulate and to remove soil. Locals joked that these shafts were the mole skylights, and children dared each other to shout down them to hear the echo. Imagine dropping a stone and waiting seconds before the faint plink of water rose from the depths. Historians still argue over the origins of the Khanate system. Did it begin in Persia around 1000 BC, or was it borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian or Egyptian techniques? Archaeological evidence suggests Persia refined and expanded the idea far beyond what neighbors attempted. But the precise birthplace remains debated. Was Persia the inventor or the master? The line blurs with every new discovery. You kneel beside the tunnel and dip your hand into the trickle of water flowing through. It's shockingly cool, far colder than the air above. You cup your hands and sip, the taste earthy and fresh, like mountain rain carried underground. For a moment, you marvel at how this simple channel, dark, quiet, and unseen, feeds not only crops and homes, but also the mighty Yakhchal. And of course, your modern humor stirs. You grin softly. So, basically, this is the ancient version of indoor plumbing, except it was kilometers long, dug by hand, and doubled as a secret air conditioner. You can almost hear a Persian engineer groaning at the comparison, but also smirking with pride. As you rise, the wind brushes your face, and you imagine the network beneath your feet. Kilometers of tunnels, an invisible web knitting mountain to village. Cold to heat, survival to ingenuity. The Yakhchal might be the visible star, but the Khanates were its silent partners, working tirelessly beneath the earth. You turn back toward the dome on the horizon, realizing how everything connects. The wind catches above, the domes of sarouj, the clay jars, and these unseen tunnels. It wasn't one invention that made Persia master the desert, but a symphony of them. Each note simple on its own, together a masterpiece. You follow the slope downward, leaving the whisper of Khanate tunnel behind, and soon the desert opens again before you. The dome of the Yakhchal rises in the distance, bathed in starlight, and as you walk, your thoughts drift toward how far these ideas traveled. You imagine caravans moving slowly across the sands, carrying not only silks and spices, but also fragments of knowledge. Little sparks of Persian ingenuity tucked into stories that cross borders as easily as camels cross dunes. Mainstream history notes that elements of Persian cooling spread into surrounding cultures. In India, stepwells and bowlies mirrored some of the principles of subterranean water storage. In the Arab world, wind catchers were adopted and refined, dotting the skylines of cities from Baghdad to Cairo. Even in the Mediterranean, techniques of insulation and underground storage bore the faint fingerprints of Persia. Cooling, once local, became global, carried along trade routes like a gift the desert insisted on sharing. Here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval Spain, under Islamic rule, some towns built ice houses with thick walls inspired by Persian designs. Locals nicknamed them Nivras, from the word for snow. Centuries later, tourists stumbled across them, baffled by stone igloos in the middle of Spain. Imagine the confusion when villagers explained, "Yes, they keep ice here. No, it's not witchcraft." Historians still argue how much of this spread was direct influence versus parallel invention. Did Persian engineers actively teach their methods abroad, or did merchants simply describe them in passing? Sparking imitation? Some evidence suggests technical exchange along the Silk Road, while others argue that necessity alone drove cultures to similar solutions. Either way, the threads of connection are undeniable. You pause to picture the journey of an idea. A merchant sits by a fire in Samarkand, recounting how Persians stored ice under domes of clay. A curious listener scribbles notes, and years later, a structure rises in another land, carrying the echo of that conversation. It's humbling. Knowledge doesn't always travel with armies or scholars. Sometimes it just tags along in the stories told at night, and your modern humor can't resist a smirk. You chuckle softly. So basically, this was the ancient version of Pinterest. Someone saw a dome, thought it was clever, and built their own version with local flair. You grin, imagining an ancient builder muttering, "Inspired by Persia, but I'll make it rustic chic," as you walk under the wide sweep of the night sky. The connections feel as vast as the constellations overhead. The Yakhchal was never just a Persian achievement. It was a spark that leapt from culture to culture, carried in whispers, adapted in bricks, reborn in distant lands. It reminds you that ingenuity is contagious, and once shared, it rarely dies. You glance back at the dome glowing in the dark, and you realize the Yakhchal is not only a monument of mud and mortar, but also a monument of memory, scattered across the world like seeds that still sprout in unexpected places. You return once more to the familiar dome, its silhouette steady against the desert horizon, and as you sit cross-legged in its shadow, your thoughts turn to the curious tug-of-war among those who study it today. Scholars, architects, and archaeologists gather in conferences, scribble in journals, and argue in coffee-stained margins, all trying to pin down the exact truth of how these mud brick marvels really worked. Mainstream history praises the ingenuity of the Yakhchal without hesitation. But the details are slipperier. Did the structures keep ice solid through an entire year? Or did they simply slow its melting enough to stretch supplies into summer? Were wind catchers and cannons absolutely essential? Or did the domes function independently in certain climates? Everyone agrees the invention mattered, but no one seems to agree on the fine print. Here's a quirky tidbit. At one academic symposium, a presenter famously compared the efficiency of the Yakhchal to that of a modern walk-in freezer, sparking a heated debate where one scholar apparently shouted, "Your numbers are colder than your conclusions." Imagine that, grown adults nearly dueling with spreadsheets over ice houses. Historians still argue over terminology. 2. Some call the Yakhchal strictly an ice house. Others insist it was more of a passive refrigerator, while a third camp argues it was closer to a community pantry. The labels might seem trivial, but for academics, naming is half the battle. It shapes how the public understands what the Persians achieved. Was this luxury, survival, or both? The disagreement refuses to thaw. You lean back against the wall, listening to the desert wind sigh through tiny cracks. In the stillness, you picture scholars poring over temperature models, students scribbling notes during lectures, engineers sketching airflow diagrams on whiteboards, all of them circling the same ancient mystery, none fully solving it. It feels almost poetic that the Yakhchal, designed to preserve ice, now preserves questions instead. And of course, your modern humor slips in. You grin and murmur. So, basically, this is the world's longest group project, 2,000 years old, still unfinished, and nobody agrees who's supposed to write the conclusion. You imagine a Persian mason rolling his eyes, muttering, "We just wanted cold water, not endless dissertations." The stars above glitter sharply, and the dome at your back hums with quiet resilience. In that moment, you realize the debates don't diminish the Yakhchal's legacy, they enhance it. Every argument, every unanswered question is proof that the structure still matters, still commands attention, still resists being fully captured by words. You close your eyes, hearing the wind rustle across the sand, and let the thoughts settle. The Yakhchal was built to hold ice, but what it truly preserves is wonder. You sit in the shadow of the dome, your journey circling back to where it began, and the desert around you feels quieter than ever. The stars overhead shimmer with icy light, scatter across the black sky like shards of frozen glass. The Yakhchal stands steady, ancient yet alive, and you sense it's time to let the story slow, time to let your thoughts drift toward rest. Mainstream history has already given you the facts. The Persians mastered insulation with sarouj, guided air with badgers, harnessed cannons to carry water, and layered ice with straw to stretch comfort through summers. They built domes so strong that some still stand after 2,000 years. And in doing so, they created the world's first refrigerators. That truth alone is enough to linger in the mind. Here's one last quirky tidbit. In a few remote villages, people still gather near surviving Yakhchals on summer evenings, not to fetch ice anymore, but simply to sit in the cool shadow and talk. Some bring fruit, others bring tea, and they laugh as if the dome were still their neighbor. In a way, it is. The Yakhchal hasn't stopped serving. It has only changed its role, from refrigerator to storyteller. Historians still argue, of course. They debate measurements, airflow, efficiency, cultural symbolism. Was the Yakhchal truly revolutionary, or simply clever adaptation? Yet the dome does not answer. It just stands, quiet and steady, as it always has, content to let questions swirl like the desert wind. Perhaps that its final lesson. Survival is not about answers, but endurance. And now, as you sit here, your eyelids growing heavier, you can't resist one last smile. You murmur softly. So, basically, the Persians figured out how to turn the desert into an ice box, and here I am, about to fall asleep inside the coolest bedtime story in history. The joke drifts into the night, light as a sigh. The stars blur, the wind softens, and your thoughts begin to melt into dream. The desert quiets now, every sound stretching longer, softer, like echoes fading into sand. The dome looms still, its beehive curve catching the faintest silver glow of moonlight, but even its presence seems gentler, less commanding. You lean back against its cool wall, breathing slowly, letting each breath expand and ease, as if the Yakhchal itself were lending you its patience. Around you, the night air smooths into a calm rhythm. The breeze carries only whispers, no sharpness, no urgency. Shadows soften at the edges, shapes blending until nothing feels separate anymore. Just one wide, restful expanse. The stars above, countless and serene, seem less like distant fires and more like a blanket, stitched in quiet light and drawn across the sky for your comfort. You close your eyes, and the story you followed, the builders mixing mortar with goat hair, the villagers gathering chilled melons, the poets praising sherbet, the scholars bickering over airflow, fades into a gentle hum. Their voices are no longer distinct, but woven together, like a lullaby sung across centuries. They are still there, preserved in memory, but now they're softer, lighter, dissolving into the calm. Your body feels heavier now, pleasantly so, like a jar tucked into cool earth, steady and safe. Each muscle slackens, each thought unwinds, and even the desert's heat feels distant, powerless against the calm that settled over you. The Yakhchal stands guard, but it doesn't need to do anything. It simply endures, and in its endurance you feel secure. Let yourself drift now, slowly, gently, as if you too are being preserved, wrapped in quiet, cooled by stillness, carried into sleep. The dome watches over you, silent and eternal, and the desert for once has nothing left to demand, only rest.